thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is Joanna Cohn. I'm director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I am delighted to be able to present our Innovations in Tobacco Control speaker for today, Dr. Jeffrey Drope. Dr. Drope has been working at the American Cancer Society since 2012, and since 2015, he has been Scientific Vice President of Economics and Health Policy Research at the ACS, and also Professor in Residence of Global Health at Marquette University. At the American Cancer Society, Dr. Drope leads a team that focuses on the nexus of public health, a number of issues, including tobacco control and nutrition, physical activity, and others, and their interaction with economic policy making, especially taxation, trade, and investment. He also works on the science and regulation of novel products, such as e-cigarettes, and tobacco's economic costs and the economics of tobacco farming. Dr. Drope's team works globally to provide technical support on these issues to governments and intergovernmental organizations, including the World Health Organization, the Secretariat of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and the United Nations Development Program. He has also been an editor of the 5th and 6th editions of the Tobacco Atlas, which everyone knows is a tremendous resource globally. Dr. Drope has a bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in International Political Economy from the University of New Mexico. And I just want to say that he is really a collaborator extraordinaire. He does really innovative and important research, and he does all that by involving key stakeholders to ensure that the research is informed in reality, but also so that the findings get used appropriately after the work is done. So he does this really well. You can always count on Dr. Drope to get things done and to get them done collaboratively, and he's just a pleasure to work with. So before I hand it over to him, I just want to mention there is a chat box, so I'll ask you to type any questions that you have into the chat box, and in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll turn to the questions. So without further ado, Dr. Drope, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Joanna. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to present our research. We're very excited about it. We think it's important, and so I'm delighted to be here and to have see such a great turnout on a Friday afternoon. I want to first acknowledge a very important acknowledgement, and that is the funding for the two main research projects I'm going to discuss today come from the Bloomberg Initiative to Reduce Tobacco Use. And this comes through the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. And I really have a special debt here to Professor Cohen. She has been a tremendous support over the years. She has supported several of our ambitious programs, and she's not just a great supporter, but she's also an incredibly great sounding board. So she has given me wise counsel over the years, and frankly to the many of us at ACS. So I'm really grateful for that collaboration with her. So thank you, Joanna. This research I'm going to discuss today really is about research collaboration. We are much better as a whole than a simple sum of our parts. So what I'm going to discuss today involved a lot of people. I have absolutely, I know, left people off this list, and my deepest apologies. I'm going to blame the pandemic because it's really handy to be able to blame that these days. My largest intellectual debt on this particular topic area, illicit trade, is to my colleague, Michal Stoklosa. Michal introduced me to this topic in earnest about 8 years ago when I started at ACS. And right away, I started to see just how very important it was to tobacco control, as I'll discuss in a few moments. And I've had a wonderful intellectual journey with him along the way over these years, and I'm grateful to him for that. I've learned a lot. I learn a lot from him every day, and he's a wonderful colleague. I also want, as you can see, with all of these different places around the Americas, you can see that we have absolutely sought to create a genuine network of scholars and other stakeholders. It's vitally important to create these networks. And I want to give a quick shout out here because this was by design. In fact, the network that we've created really blossomed, if you will, at a meeting in Costa Rica, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And it involved Jackie Drope, my sister, Rosa Sandoval, Patricia Sosa, and Guillermo Paraje. And we sort of hatched this idea to try to get more researchers really involved in illicit trade studies and related research. And we really sought to build this group of amazing scholars that you see here. As well, Jackie Drope has been instrumental in helping to find resources to fund a lot of these other studies that I'll mention briefly towards the end. So it really is about creating a body of evidence to support tobacco control, and I'm really grateful to all the people involved here. It really is a true research collaboration, and I just wanted to point out here the different types of organizations. We have NGOs, IGOs, universities, think tanks, and it really takes a village for us to succeed in tobacco control, mainly because we're also resource constrained and probably more so now. So it's going to take even more village. And I really am grateful to all of these organizations and the individuals in them for making this type of research and related work happen. So why do we care about illicit trade? I think we always have to ask this question in our own research. If we can't answer it, we probably shouldn't be doing it. So I'm going to answer it here for us. But first, I want to talk about what is illicit trade. I know I'm preaching to many of the converted here, but there are obviously some folks on here that might not know this topic area as well. It is really about the unlawful sale or purchase of products, in this case, tobacco products. And what we really mean by this is that taxes that were due were not paid in the jurisdiction where they were supposed to be paid. As we'll learn, sometimes taxes are paid in another jurisdiction, a lower tax jurisdiction, and then taken somewhere else, but they're not paid where they're supposed to be paid, and this is a real problem. I want to be clear, this is not tax avoidance, which is the legal avoiding of taxes. So, for example, when you go through duty-free and buy under your limit, that is legal tax avoidance, and it is not the same thing as what I'm talking about today. So let's move to the harms of illicit tobacco trade. To begin, we know that illicit trade in tobacco products is bad for public health. There's no doubt about this. We know that, and you'll see this in a moment when I present some research results, is it decreases the average price of cigarettes. And as we know from decades of other research, lower prices mean higher consumption. And higher consumption, of course, means increased tobacco-related morbidity and mortality. We also know that kids tend to have easier access to illicit products, and we know that in most countries, these illicit products don't have the health warnings that they are compelled to have, and that we know work in terms of warning users about the dangers of tobacco use. So you can see that these other dynamics are bad for public health as well. And there are still others that I won't get into here. There's another dimension, and it's a fiscal one. We know that it undermines everything about tax, if you will. It undermines revenues, that's the very obvious one, but it undermines administration and policy in general. It can lead to higher levels of corruption and crime. And this last one is a really tricky one. Are illicit products potentially more harmful? Well, let's just say the bar's really low here, right? So we're talking about the world's most dangerous consumer product, where between 50 and 60% of tobacco users succumb to their own tobacco use eventually. So that bar's low. Yes, are there illicit products that are more dangerous because they have even more harmful constituents? Probably yes, in some cases yes. However, that's not really the problem I'm going to bed at night worried about. But this one here, I am going to bed at night worried about. And this is really a more systemic issue, and that is that illicit trade is used, or the threat of illicit trade is used to undermine our tobacco control efforts by the tobacco industry and its allies. So they say, oh, you shouldn't raise taxes because it's going to cause illicit trade, and that's going to hurt government revenues, or kids are going to have access to cigarettes, which is quite ironic. In any event, we know that this has been happening all over the world. It happens basically in every single country, and we're constantly working against this. And this is why we need independent, transparent, and rigorous research, because we need to understand what the real facts are. What is the magnitude of the illicit trade? And is there misinformation? As you'll find out, it's almost always misinformation from the tobacco industry and others. But sometimes there are actual genuine problems, and we need to be armed with the correct information to be able to address these challenges. So this is why this enterprise that my colleagues that I mentioned earlier and I have been so dogged in our pursuit of over the last number of years. So there's very good reason why we should care about this, and why research is fundamental to helping us to resolve these challenges. I think it's important to think a little bit about the causes of illicit trade. There's certainly a demand side. Some tobacco users are going to want cheaper tobacco products, and we have to know that that's a reality. But I think that the supply side is a far more important one here, and much more consequential. And that is about legal and illegal tobacco manufacturers generating these products and then distributing them and selling them. They want more profits, more sales. They want to increase market share. Sometimes they want to penetrate new markets, and often it's facilitated by corruption, criminality, and or lack of enforcement capacity. So all of these things matter. This isn't really the topic of my talk today, but it is important to understand why this happens. I get asked this question an awful lot, very often by people in ministries of finance, is illicit trade a tax issue? And let me give you the short answer. As you can see from our colleague Luke Eustons and colleagues from 10 years ago, the answer is really no. What we actually see is higher income countries have lower illicit trade penetration. What it comes down to most of the time is governance, good governance. And so we tend to see higher prices in states that are better governed. Not always, but statistically we tend to see that trend. But I think it has more also to do with effort. And what we've been seeing, for example, is in several countries with, frankly, lower levels of governance, they're actually working hard on this issue, and they're having tremendous success at dealing with it and lowering these levels of illicit trade to very, very low levels. So it's not just about governance. I would be remiss if I didn't show you these next two slides. Michal really loves these two slides from the recent monograph in 2016. But what we see here is the price per pack off on the right-hand side of the horizontal axis. Those are the more expensive places. As cigarettes become more expensive, which almost always means higher taxes, we actually see lower levels of illicit trade. And similarly here, we do see a relationship between governance. The countries on the right-hand side of the x-axis, they have a better governance, and then we see that slope of the scatter plot going down towards those countries. So better governance, lower levels of illicit trade. Not really surprising by any indication. So how do we measure illicit trade? There are actually a number of different ways that we can measure illicit trade. Sorry, got a brief interruption here. This is what happens when you hijack your 13-year-old daughter's room because she has the best bandwidth in the house, so I apologize. So what we use are, the gap analysis is the gap between the reported consumption and the tax paid sales in a specific jurisdiction. So it's that gap, if you will, the estimated illicit trade that you see there, is the tax avoidance and the tax evasion. And I must say that tax evasion is always much more than tax avoidance. So it's really the one that we concentrate on. But there are some struggles that we have with this. For example, we know that in survey research that we have massive issues quite often with underreporting. So we don't really necessarily know, just from using the basic survey data, if the reported consumption is accurate. We've developed some excellent methods to deal with this, but it's still not perfect. Similarly, we've had issues in some countries with illicit exports, and these are not captured in these gap analyses either. So you might actually have a country as the source of illicit products, and that can actually bias these estimates. And so quite often, our estimates can be quite conservative and frankly flat out wrong. So why do we do these if they're problematic? They're not always problematic. If we have good data, they can be actually quite good. They're cheap, to put it crudely. They're very inexpensive because you're relying on secondary data. We know they're quick. We can do them fast at our computer, and we can repeat them regularly and consistently. And we really like to see what the trends look like in time, particularly when there have been changes in policy, such as a tax increase. What are the disadvantages? I just spoke of several of the methodological ones. We also know that cigarette sales are seasonal, and that can really mess up our calculations. We know that some surveys exclude sometimes very important groups like youth, so that can be problematic. And then, of course, we don't learn very much or anything about the nature of the illicit trade or about the people using illicit products. I'm not dismissing gap analyses, we use them a lot, but we sometimes need more information, and I'm going to talk a bit about how we get that information. Generally, what we like to do is we like to examine actual cigarette packs. They have all sorts of unique characteristics that we can use to be able to identify whether a pack is licit or illicit. They've got stamps, health warnings, duty-free markings, price, content information, all sorts of things. It just really depends on the country. We use two different methods in the studies I'm going to present today. There are actually several others, but the two big ones are what we call littered pack examination, where we actually go through the streets and pick up garbage. And we have a joke at ACS and amongst this group of scholars working on this, and that is garbage doesn't lie. So what you pick up is what you pick up. And then we also have smoker survey pack shows or pack examination, where we go and we interview smokers and we ask them to show us their packs and then hopefully take pictures of those packs so that we can post facto look at that information more carefully. It's absolutely key in both of these types of studies to obtain a representative sample. And let me be clear, this is not an overall population representative sample, but one that represents the actual consumption of cigarettes. And this is vital because if you were to do just a population representative sample, you're not actually going to be representing the cigarettes consumed, because as we all know, cigarette and all tobacco consumption is not spread evenly across the population. We have discrete groups in every country that use cigarettes or other tobacco products a lot more. So it's really important that we be able to understand that we're getting a sample that represents this consumption. In an ideal universe, we use prevalence and intensity. A lot of times we don't have those data at a small a smaller unit level, like a census tract or something similar. So we use proxies, things that we use to predict prevalence and intensity even, things like income and education, age, sex, etc. What are the advantages of examining cigarette packs? Well, we think they're more reliable than self-reported data because we can actually see it, and people do have incentives to misrepresent their self-reported data. We have the possibility to capture information about these packs, like their origins. We can learn about market shares of specific illicit brands. We can learn a lot about those who are smoking illicit products, because that can help us to formulate strategies to deal with this. For example, public education campaigns. What are some of the disadvantages? Well, the big one's always the dollar sign, right? It's more costly and longer to conduct these types of studies. So it is something that we have to consider when we're doing these studies. And you'll see, you know, we've been careful with how we're choosing, you know, cities to work in, countries to work in, etc. We know that smoker surveys require ethics approval. As we learned in Brazil, this can take a very long time. Litter pack collections are by nature, we can't walk every street in every country, so there is a limited geographical coverage. We also know that it can be hard in some countries where the distinctions, the markers on the packages aren't very helpful for unique characteristics. Although I would say we haven't had really big problems with that. That in most countries we can usually find really good characteristics that help us make these determinations. Single stick sales can also be a struggle, although I'll talk about that in the Mexico study in particular, that we are able to overcome some of those challenges. There are some really useful complementary methodologies that we use. As I said, with single sticks, there are several different types of strategies that we use. There was a really great study recently in India where they actually asked sellers to keep the packs and then went back and collected them at the end of each day. And so that was a really great way of doing it. In Mexico and other places, and Colombia as well, we've used visual inspection. So you actually can go and look at what people are selling and what people are buying, and you can look at the at the cigarettes that you buy as a single stick and compare them to what you know are illicit and illicit. So there are definitely ways to overcome it. What about expert interviews? I get asked about this quite a bit. My short answer to that is we don't really like them most of the time. They're a favorite of the industry, but what we actually see is that the evidence is at best anecdotal. Very often I see a sort of detection bias where if you look for it, you find it. And we often, when we embark on these studies with our colleagues, they're very excited to go look for illicit trade. That's not what we want to do if we're developing actual independent, rigorous estimates. You have to look in the places, you have to look in every place. You need the total universe or as close to it as you can get, or representation thereof. And so this has been really important in terms of making sure that we develop these rigorous measures, basically because often we're counting these so-called expert interviews. Now, that said, there are specific times when we do use them. In Colombia, for example, our colleagues used it to try to understand the supply chains for illicit products. So it was really actually very, very helpful in trying to understand those complexities. So it shouldn't be dismissed outright. Let me pause for a moment here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a really fantastic study that was done in Mexico and led by my colleagues Belén Sáenz de Miera and Luz Miriam Renales. This was a fantastic study. I have to say, it was the gold standard of methodological cross-validation. They did gap analysis, littered pack collection, smoker surveys, and looked at single sticks. So it was really a remarkable study and took a tremendous amount of outstanding work. Before I get into the methodologies and results, I want to actually speak to something Joanna mentioned at the beginning, and that was about engaging stakeholders, their participation, their feedback, their buy-in, their ownership. And this was really led by our leads that I mentioned a moment ago, our colleagues in government, and I have to give a shout out to Arturo Sabinas at CONADIC and Miguel Malo at the PAHU country office. Everybody was on board. This was an incredibly great effort to make sure that everybody was engaged in this and that there was shared ownership. We received a ton of feedback from government agencies. So by the time the study was done and the results generated, everybody was involved and I think felt like they were involved. And I think this was really important as to why it was taken seriously in official circles. So I would call this a best practice. It's not always possible, I will tell you, because we work in some countries where we don't get this type of engagement. So it was, I wouldn't say unusual, but it certainly was welcome and a fantastic component of the work that we did there. The team first sought out to do a gap analysis. We have, as many of you know, good data, survey data in Mexico, for example, the GATS and some excellent national addiction surveys. So we can actually get pretty good calculations of consumption. However, we don't have the same luxury with tobacco sales. And you can see in this crazy graph here, a massive spike that we saw in volumes of cigarette exports. We also saw modifications to official figures by the statistical agency. In the end, we really figured out that we just couldn't trust these figures, and it really reinforced for us that our decision to spend resources to explore pack examinations in 2 different ways was the right one. Pack examination. I'm not going to get into the many characteristics that we used in Mexico. If you go to the Tobacco Atlas website, you can download the full report. It is amazingly rigorous. It's, I think, 115 pages. So you can go and find out about all of the sampling methodology, the distinct features that we used to identify what were licit and illicit. But you can see that the packages actually have a lot of different features, just looking at, you know, for sale in Mexico, the warning labels, you know, the other characteristics that you can see very plainly on these packages that make them quite unique and fairly easy to recognize when a pack is legal or not. So we actually used complementary methodologies here. More than 2,300 face-to-face surveys were carried out in people's homes across 8 large Mexican cities. And then in these same cities, in the same census tracts, we actually were able to collect more than 8,200 packs from the Mexican streets. The sampling was random, and it was done superbly by our sampling expert, and it really permits these estimates to be represented by city. So it's pretty exciting that not only did we come up with a 8-city overall estimate, but we really did come up with estimates to help us understand what was going on in each of these cities, which are really vital when you have regional variation, as we'll see in 1 second. So the Mexican results here. I'll just look at the overall results, but what we have is actually very, by international standards or international findings, very low levels. 8.8 in the lizard pack, and then 7.6 in the smoker survey. So really low. This compares to the estimate by the industry, which at the same time was 17%. So you can see it's basically half of what the industry was claiming. We can also see really large variation. You can see up in the left corner in Hermosillo, very low levels. And then down towards Mexico City and Leon, much higher levels. But then when you get into Mexico City, where the largest proportion by far of smokers in the country live, actually the levels are quite low again. So we see tremendous variation, and this really helps us. And I think that our colleagues in the ministries that are responsible for enforcing this were also very grateful for this type of information. I think this variation can be attributed to a number of things, different degrees of corruption and different degrees of influence of organized crime, deficiencies in mechanisms to enforce keeping illicit trade off the streets, and also different types of informal networks that exist to distribute these products. I will tell you that the prices were quite different between the illicit and licit brands. Illicit cigarettes were about 65% of the licit ones. And that's significant. And you can imagine that it has market effects in terms of consumption. So again, harkening back to what I said about the effects on public health, we don't want these cheap cigarettes on the streets by any means. We did address the issue of single sticks. What we know in Mexico is there are a lot of single stick users, as there are in many countries. One survey had it around 50%. So the team went into the streets and did random sampling of sellers, informal sellers selling these single sticks at kiosks and mobile vendors. And what's amazing is that we learned that brand alone was actually an incredibly good predictor of licit versus illicit. So we had all of this, frankly, enormous laundry list of characteristics. And what we found was brand was actually pretty good, really good actually, you know, into the high 90s in terms of reliability. So we knew that when we were capturing brand in the smoker survey, that we were actually getting accurate information on licit versus illicit. This is the team in Mexico City when we launched the report at the National Institutes for Respiratory Diseases. We had a tremendously great event there with a widely covered and cited press conference where Belen and Luz Miriam did a phenomenal job with the Deputy Minister of Health. who was very excited about our research. So it really received a lot of fantastic press. Good news, research matters. As it turns out, the government really was facing a structural problem in terms of the existing tax structure didn't index to inflation. And so in late 2019, they agreed to index and retroactively back to 2011 when the last tax increase was, and then agreed to index thereafter. But what this really meant was a tax increase, and a very large one. So this has had a positive increase on prices, which will have a negative increase on consumption. We look forward to being able to measure that going forward. We also learned from reliable sources that our work was taken very seriously by the government, and that's always reassuring. So they felt that it helped them to understand that this supposed threat of illicit trade was a supposed threat and really not a real one, or at least it was a manageable one. I'm going to take a pause here and move to the Brazil study. This is led by my fantastic colleagues, Valesca, Roberto, and Andre. Again, a phenomenal team, a really great study. Let me reiterate or share with you that these are preliminary studies, so please don't cite these quite yet. We're just doing the finishing touches on the final report, and we look forward to launching this study very, very soon. But they have given me permission to share some of our findings, so I'm excited to do that today. Again, we did littered pack collection, and this time in 5 cities, and then we did a smoker survey in 2 of the largest, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Again, this was just about resource constraints. It's very expensive to do the smoker survey, which is why we only did them in the 2 largest cities. We chose these cities actually because they were the cities that we had previous evidence that there were problems with illicit trade in these cities. So in a way, Brazil's an important case because in many countries, we know that illicit trade is low, even if the industry is saying it's not. And in Brazil, we have actual evidence that illicit trade is a genuine problem. And what we really want to understand is what's the nature of the problem? How does it change over time? How do our estimates compare to the industry estimates? These are really important questions we need to answer. So this is why we feel it's really important to undertake this type of study in a country like Brazil. We collected data across 70 census tracts, and we had selected those. Again, we had an excellent sampling team, and we used sex, age, and socioeconomic profile of these census tracts to be able to identify where we thought cigarette consumption was occurring. We used registered brands and presence of the official Brazilian graphic warning labels as our indicators of licitness. So here are some preliminary results. We collected more than 8,600 packs in these 5 cities. And you can see a very wide variation across these cities. Rio de Janeiro had the lowest level, just above 30. And Campo Grande, very near the Paraguayan border, had the highest level of illicit trade. And that wasn't a real surprise to us because when we look at these packs, and we can see very clearly that the vast majority of them come from Paraguay. They are tax unpaid in Brazil, but they are coming from Paraguay. Sometimes tax paid in Paraguay, sometimes not tax paid in Paraguay. In any event, we absolutely learned that this is an issue and that there is regional variation across the country. We were able to look at the pack survey of smokers versus the littered survey, and we can see that they were pretty close in the 2 cities where we did both types of surveys. In this case, we saw that the littered packs were a little bit more. If you recall back to the Mexico figure, it actually varied there. It depended on the city. And so we see that these methods really are complementary. So if you don't have the resources to do them both, that's a real luxury. We can see that the littered pack, which tends to be much less expensive, is very much a reasonable choice to go if you can't do the smoker surveys as well. In this figure here, we actually are showing prices. And again, like the Mexico case, we see that the price per pack of cigarettes, that's on the vertical axis there, we can see that most of the cigarettes were between 6 and 9 reais. whereas you can see down below that most of the illicit cigarettes were between 3 and 4 reais. So this is a really big difference, as you can see. And again, we worry about the public health implications. All that said, I do want to point something out important about Brazil. Although we observe these high levels of illicit cigarette consumption in these cities, we know that smoking prevalence has been systematically decreasing across the country for a number of years now. We also know statistically that a lot of this is due to the Brazilian government making a commitment to raising tobacco excise taxes. This, I guess, in a lot of ways is a beautiful illustration of the fact that even in the face of a very sizable illicit trade problem, tobacco taxation still works. And so we really think that this is an important takeaway from this. We also learn here that geographical proximity matters a lot. We're very concerned about this, obviously. We know that a lot of the variables that we see in different countries in terms of illicit trade matter, you know, governance, enforcement, et cetera. But we think probably the overarching issue here is the bilateral relationship between Brazil and Paraguay. If these governments can figure this out, we're going to see these levels of illicit trade plummet. So we're very hopeful that this is something in the near future that will happen. I want to give another teaser, appetizer to a forthcoming study. There have been several other studies done on measuring illicit trade in Brazil. My colleagues Roberto Iglesias and Andre Sklo have, as many of you know, been working with a phone survey database over the years. So we're actually able to compare our results to those, and we're also able to compare them to a study in the garbage dump in Rio, which is also extremely exciting. So keep your eyes out for forthcoming research. There's a lot of great stuff coming out of Brazil and our amazing colleagues there. I just want to mention that we've had really an effort to do a lot of work in this area. And I'm just going to give a shout out to a few other recent studies, mostly sponsored by ACS. As I mentioned before, although one of the Columbia studies was also co-sponsored with our colleagues at Cancer Research UK, who were very generous and saw the utility of getting involved in this as well. In Colombia, many of you have seen this research by our friends at Fundación ANASH. They've done a couple of really fantastic studies on illicit trade measurement. In this case, they did it before and after a major tax increase. So that was very exciting and very important. And what we learned is that before the tax increase in 2017, illicit trade was very low, 3.5%. And that compared to industry estimates of 14 to 18%. So you can see a massive difference, fourfold, fivefold difference here. And then it did go up a little bit after the tax increase, and it was a large tax increase, as many of you are familiar. And it went up to 6.4. And as I said before, that's a really low level of illicit trade by global standards. So even after a sizable increase, it was very clear they were managing this very well. So it's a fantastic study. There's a lot, several excellent reports and some very good peer-reviewed journal articles about this as well in tobacco control and other venues. My colleague Guillermo Paraje led an amazing study in Santiago, where about 40% of people in Chile live. In this case, they used a smoker survey. I'm going to call out two things here. One, they found that illicit trade was less than 11%, which compared to the BAT widely publicized estimate of 24%. These comparisons seem almost ridiculous. And I might mention too that all of these industry estimates come with no information, not transparent, not rigorous. We really quite often have no idea how they came up with these measures. The other thing I want to say is that they used a really novel sampling method where they used high traffic areas combined with the characteristics of smokers from the National Health Survey to be able to identify cigarette consumption in the city. And so it was more expensive to go house to house. And so this was a way of saving resources and still being able to generate a really fantastic sample. So you're going to, and I'm going to talk about this at the end, but we're going to see a forthcoming publication about some of these innovative methodologies. I want to also mention that in Chile, we were able to find out some other amazing things. Growth of flavored cigarettes, growth among young women and girls. So you can learn a lot of really important public health lessons, and it's helping to shape strategies towards tobacco control in these countries. In Buenos Aires, we had, again, another our colleagues at FEE Argentina. They, in Buenos Aires, a 4% level, which compared to estimates of 14 to 22% by the industry. So it was really, again, quite a stunning juxtaposition of findings. I want to call them out as well in a good way. Work in the sampling, they actually visited 50% of the geographical area of Buenos Aires. And I think the point here is that, you know, most of the time we want people to do samples to minimize the expense. But in this case, what they showed us is they did an incredibly comprehensive sample, 50%, and they did it really cheaply. So a real shout out to them, because it was a phenomenally great study. I just received an email about 45 minutes ago, and I didn't get to incorporate this from Marita Pizarro from PEAK, but they have completed another study of 7 cities of litter pack collection, and they found, again, they did find that it was higher than Buenos Aires, but again, much lower than the tobacco industry's estimates. We're just finishing up a study in Peru with 3 cities with both types, smoker survey and littered packs, and then in Ecuador as well. So stay tuned, because these are both going to be really great studies, again, adding to the canon of work by all of these amazing researchers. So I'm gonna conclude now, and then I'll open it up for questions. I just want to say a few really important things to bring this all together and try to reflect on the body of work here, the body of evidence that has been generated by this amazing group of people. It's critical, I believe, to validate our estimates of illicit trade based on different methodologies. We're not always going to have this luxury, but we can see that when we can, it's really helpful. And I also think it reassures some of our key stakeholders in government. And so being able to do this is really important. We know that we want to repeat estimates over time and be able to understand what the trends look like in the marketplace, especially when things are changing. We might have a change in government. We might have a change in policy, such as a tax increase, and we want to understand the implications of that. As I mentioned, and Joanna mentioned, engaging stakeholders is really key. If we can do it, we must, because that is going to make our research matter more. So I really, I think the Mexican example is a great one. This is a showstopper here. I know you're going to be shocked, but the tobacco industry lies. And what really blows us away is by how shameless they are in their lying. You see the magnitude of their lies, you know, 3-fold, 4-fold, 5-fold, you know, an incredible record of lying, as you've seen here. These estimates clearly cannot be trusted. And now that we have this body of work, we can take it to policymakers and say, hey, look, they lie everywhere, so don't believe them. That said, we do recognize that countries can have genuine challenges, but these types of studies can help us understand what these challenges look like. So I'm very excited that we're doing studies like the one in Brazil and the one in Ecuador, where we can actually pinpoint some of the issues, and it will help policymakers and others to resolve these issues. For example, issues with neighboring countries, as we saw in Brazil. We've seen increasing issues with illicit production in some countries, and this has been a change, because it's much less about smuggling in some places and much more about illegal manufacturing. As always, and this is another shocker, the industry involvement is one that we can uncover here, because we can understand from these packages who's involved. And for example, are these products being overproduced in a neighboring country by tobacco manufacturers knowingly and then smuggled to other countries? We have a tremendous amount of evidence in countries around the world of this type of behavior. We can learn, as I said, other important features of just tobacco products and to help us in our tobacco control efforts. We can learn about the types of products, we can learn about price, we can learn about warning labels. For example, we can see if in fact the distribution of warning labels are consistent with the law. we learned in Argentina about counterfeit tax stamps. So we can learn a ton and make us better at doing our jobs in terms of tobacco control and helping policymakers to make policy better. Lastly, I want to just say there's lots of resources on the Tobacco Atlas website, and I want to give a plug for a forthcoming toolkit that's coming from our colleagues at Tobacconomics at UIC in Chicago and ACS, and it is to measure illicit trade. So, you know, you can try this at home, and we're here to help as well. So, Joanna, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Everyone, please use the chat box to type in any questions you have. And maybe I'll get started as people are typing. You know, you just do a fantastic job taking a complex topic and explaining it so well. But let me start. One of the things that stood out to me was you mentioning how well brand predicted or was related to, you know, illicit, what you were finding in terms of illicit sales or illicit product. Is there any recourse for that? Is there a way to go after specifically those brands or companies making those brands?
Yeah, so in that particular instance, I was actually talking about how in Mexico, we were able to use brand as a proxy for illicit versus illicit. But to answer your question is a little bit different in that we learn these things about brand. And my answer is absolutely categorically, we can use that to go after companies that are clearly doing egregious things. I mean, for example, you know, if you see a set of packages, you know, consistently made by a company that are tax paid in another jurisdiction, and then they're suddenly showing up in your jurisdiction, you should absolutely categorically be calling out that company on that behavior. There's no doubt in my mind, and it's been used successfully in lawsuits as well in Europe. So the answer is for sure yes.
Okay, great. We have a number of questions that are coming in, so I'll just jump right into them. So we have one question about doing this kind of work in a low and middle income country, in a country with limited resources. I mean, you talked about sort of the expense related to smokers surveys and that littered pack work is less expensive. What would you recommend for people, for researchers or NGOs who want to get a handle on illicit trade in their country, but don't have a lot of funds to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joanna. Thank you. My recommendation, honestly, is that littered packs are really inexpensive. So in those same countries that you're talking about, we almost always find that the gap analyses aren't good, and that's because the data aren't great. So we don't see great surveys to help us understand the overall consumption, and we don't see great data on tobacco sales, tax-paid sales. So we're really left with no choice but to try other methods. And we think the littered pack has proven itself to be just as good as a smoker survey. Yeah, it's true. You don't get the information about who's smoking, but you get the information about the types of illicit trade going on, and you get a really solid estimate that is completely defensible. And they're very, very inexpensive. I'll call out Michal again. He did a great study in Warsaw, Poland some years ago, and he used university students to go walk the streets, and they did it really, really inexpensively, and it was a fantastic study.
Great, thanks for that. Do you have a feel for the extent to which the tobacco industry itself is complicit in supporting illicit trade?
I have a feel, and my feel is they're very complicit in a lot of places. We have a forthcoming study in a country that I won't speak to yet. I don't want to give it away, but we're definitely, there's just no way we can look at this and think it's anything but complicity and I mean, maybe flat out participation of the tobacco industry. I'm not saying that's always the issue, but it is certainly the issue in some countries. And then I guess sometimes we have to think about what is the tobacco industry, because we obviously think about the huge multinational ones, but you know, if we think about what's going on in Paraguay, for example, these are legal manufacturers in Paraguay. It's not like they're making the factories in Paraguay. These are legal cigarettes, many of them tax paid in Paraguay, in marketplace. So let's not pretend. So to me, that's the tobacco industry, because it's legal and it's big and it's multi-million dollar. So they have resources.
All right. So there's a question about helping out in Africa, whether you have any plans to do this kind of work in Africa, number one, but also number two, the comment has to do with the borders in Africa seem to be quite porous, and therefore would you anticipate more illicit trade in some parts of Africa?
Yeah, so that's a great, well, let me start with the technical question. Yes, porous borders often mean higher levels of illicit trade, not always, really, because it comes down to price differentials, right? If you already have cheap cigarettes and there's no incentive to smuggle them in from somewhere else because they're not any cheaper, you can have totally porous borders and it won't matter one bit, right? It's where there are porous borders and you have more expensive cigarettes than your neighbor that we become very worried. Do we have plans to do studies in Africa? We always have plans to do studies. Our issue is always finding the funding for it. And I think this has become even more difficult in the current pandemic environment here. But yeah, we're very open to it, and we're very open to working with people to try to find resources as well. It's definitely a difficult time, but you can also do these studies fairly inexpensively. So I definitely encourage people to consider it.
Great. So you mentioned that one of the problems with illicit trade is that it results in cheaper cigarettes. But in a few countries, I think we found that the illicit cigarettes are actually more expensive than the legal cigarettes, thinking possibly as an aspirational product that people in certain social classes might use those products or purchase those products to show their status. But I guess, so you might not have the challenges with having cheaper product, but there's still a lot of problems with that too. The government might not be collecting tax revenue that they should be. You're not having the health warning label on the packs that you should have as an educational sort of intervention. Is there anything you can say about that? Have you come across that in your work? And any thoughts on that?
We have absolutely come across exactly the dynamic that you described, and you're right. I mean, what it probably is a company that can't sell that brand legally, and they want to establish themselves in that marketplace, maybe even increase the penetration of the market share. So they have other incentives. You're absolutely right. It's not just price. Now, price is huge. It's a big one, and it's probably the biggest one. But what you describe absolutely happens all over the world, and it can happen at the same time too as these other dynamics. So you see different brands, and again, that's why we love these pack examinations, because then you can say, hey, wait a minute, I've got these really expensive brands coming from France. Sorry, France, if you're out there. And then I've got these really cheap brands being manufactured in these clandestine factories in, downtown Asuncion or wherever. So it really varies. And again, we learn so much from these pack surveys about these dynamics. So they're really rich, and we can give that information to our colleagues in government, and they can actually then tackle these problems. Because as you said, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's bad for public health.
We have a question from Bangladesh. It's late in Bangladesh at the moment.
Thank you.
Is there any relation, or can you say anything about the relationship between duty-free sales and illicit trade?
Yeah. So, duty-free sales are typically, in theory, they're legal, right? And I think that quite possibly it creates some opportunities, some additional opportunities for tax evasion, perhaps. in terms of, especially if those duty-free products are not being held to the same standards, that maybe it's possible to get products onto the market that are actually tax evading as well, that are similar looking. I think more to the point, though, is a bigger one that the protocol is trying. The protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products is trying to handle, and that is, eventually we don't want duty-free products, right? So I think it's mostly a separate issue from, for example, the smuggling, not completely, but mostly separate. But I think that it's its own issue because we end up with cheaper cigarettes and we have the same public health problems and sometimes the same warning label problems depending on the country's rules. You know, eventually what I would love to see is just an elimination of duty-free sales of tobacco products, period. That would be the dream.
I think this is going to be our last question because we're almost out of time. So this one is great because it's about another topic that you're interested in, electronic cigarettes. So have you seen or heard or studied anything about illicit markets for e-cigarettes? And the comment mentions that there are some countries are requiring taxes on e-cigarettes, but also I don't know if we're seeing counterfeit or sort of certainly knockoffs of very popular brands being produced by other manufacturers to try and get some market share. So anything you can say about that?
Yeah, so I can tell you that we have not done any systematic studies on illicit products for novel tobacco products like e-cigarettes. I could tell you anecdotally, because we obviously look at this a lot, our team at American Cancer Society, that is, what we're really seeing is just, frankly, just all around a lack of product regulation in most countries, and really just almost a lawlessness going on around these products. So it's really hard to even evaluate in most countries because the laws, frankly, haven't oftentimes caught up with the market. And so you could look at it and go, oh, those are illicit, those are illicit in the countries where we actually have registered brands and registered products. But quite frankly, we don't have that in most places. So it's really, the complexities around this are really difficult to understand and to measure. As well, there's such a heterogeneity of products. I mean, we have these open systems that I can make in my bathroom, right? And that's fundamentally different. You know, I suppose I could grow my own tobacco and roll it. I'm probably not going to, but it's pretty easy to get the constituent parts really easy in many countries to get the constituent parts of e-cigarettes and to make your own, e-juice or what have you. So there are all sorts of complexities. Definitely another webinar.
Okay, yes, we'll do that. Yeah, a really complex question, but thank you for asking it. So I want to we're out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you for your excellent questions. If you want to see this again, or if you have colleagues who weren't able to make it, a recording of this lecture will be on our YouTube channel very shortly. So thank you, Jeff, so much for such a great presentation and sharing this terrific work that from you and your colleagues on the important topic of illicit trade. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you everyone for coming today. I really, really appreciate it.